Hi, I'm Michelle Owens. I'm the principal of the Center for Christian Studies, which is a diaconal training school, one of the theological schools of the United Church of Canada. We are also affiliated with the Anglican Church of Canada, so we specialize in education for deacons and education for diaconal ministers. Our roots stretch back into the 1890s with training deaconesses, and today I'm here to talk about our learning so far in trying to plan some new education opportunities for ministers in process of admission to the United Church of Canada. So we're very grateful that we were given an innovation grant towards this work by EDGEy, and this is very much a in process piece that we are still in. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've learned over the last couple of years as we've gone through this. In September of 2019, after having reviewed the current or the former process of how ministers come into the United Church of Canada from other denominations, the General Council Office sent the theological colleges a request for proposals to change the orientation and education process, the education components of the admissions process. So previously, there had been a process where ministers who were in the midst of admission would be working in a ministry site, usually a congregation, and they were also required to take a set of courses at theological colleges. And these courses were things like Christian education, but from a United Church perspective, or worship, but from a United Church perspective. But since what was happening was the admissions ministers were being enrolled in classes with students who were just working on an MDiv or another diploma, sometimes that wasn't a great fit. And so there have been some problems along the way. One of the stumbling blocks was actually the relationship between the theological schools and the United Church of Canada. So this was a place where the United Church changed what it wanted and what it was envisioning, and then told the schools, hey, do you want to do this? And one of the questions that will come up again later is what it was like for the schools to receive a request for proposals. So did that put us in a position of competing against one another in the way that a city might put out a tender for competing bids for a construction site? And was this going to be a collaborative process between the schools or with the denomination? So it really highlighted some questions about what the relationships were between all of these partners. There has also been a lack of consensus on the project goals. So where some people did feel that the previous way of doing things, having admissions ministers in class with students who were just learning how to become ministers, was not an optimal situation, many schools who had been hosting and offering those classes felt from their perspective that that had been working quite well, and were surprised to hear such criticism of the education that had been happening. Another one of the big stumbling blocks we ran into was that when this proposal was under discussion at the Theological Schools Circle, a meeting of the heads of schools, which was happening in person in 2019 in Toronto, the way it fell on the agenda was immediately after the announcement of a very significant funding cut to the schools. And this was a place where the funding cut was announced, we all heard it, and then we were dealing with a request to do something new. And we also shifted in that moment at that time from a conversation with a staff person who was well known, trusted, and in the room, to a staff person who was on Zoom on the other side of the country and not known by most people in the room. And that really shaped, in my perspective, I was actually facilitating the meeting, really shaped how that conversation went down, because some of the emotion from the previous funding cut decision slid right into the discussion of how people were prepared to respond to the request for proposals. So that it put us into this place immediately of having a discussion about whether we were working in competition with one another or whether people wanted to move towards collaboration. It was not entirely clear whether the church was asking for one program that they would give permission to run and send their folks to, which would mean shutting down programs that other schools had previously been running, or whether people were going to be all producing options that were going to be approved, or whether the schools were going to work towards one comprehensive program that they were going to produce within collaboration. This was a place where the vested interests of the schools, because some were already running programs and some were not, and the fiduciary duty of the people sitting in the room came into play. So while when I am sitting in the principal circle with the other United Church heads of schools, I am, as a United Church minister, wanting the best for my denomination. I am also balancing that with the fiduciary duty I have as the principal of the Center for Christian Studies to be protecting and advancing the interests of my school. And this made these conversations quite challenging at times. One of the other questions that has followed, I think, from the very beginning of looking at years ago how we were bringing people into the United Church of Canada from other denominations is the question of whose table is this? Who gets to make the decisions? What is the appropriate process for orientation? Who is doing the gatekeeping? Who is doing the planning? And this who is doing the planning question is one that continues to be very live. Who is invited? Not only to the educational opportunities, but who is invited to the table to plan them or to make decisions about how they are going to be planned. And because we are talking about a place where we are often talking about folks who are coming from overseas or through immigration processes, as well as people who are coming from other Canadian denominations, this is a site of activity and thought in the church where we are confronted with issues of gatekeeping, racism, and colonialism. And so this is all of the things get brought into the mix as we move into trying to think about are we working with a model of competencies, which is what the new model is, that there are competencies that the admissions board is looking for people to attain? Or are we looking that there are courses that we think people should be taking? Because courses and competencies can complement each other, but sometimes trying to get those two systems to work together can be difficult. So when we're talking about requirements, what are we talking about? And of course, the picture down at the bottom there, this entire conversation has happened in the context now of also being in the middle of a pandemic. In terms of progress, the schools did manage a joint submission of program proposals. That wasn't one proposal worked on collaboratively, but it was a joint submission of everyone's proposals together, more or less, because the question of who was at the table came to bite us again, because there were schools who didn't have, because of staff transition, people involved in an initial planning process, which meant that not every school was immediately included in the submissions, and there had to be a bit of a scramble to make sure that everyone who wanted a submission had time and space to have their submission included. There has been continued dialogue, planning, and relationship building among the schools and with GCO staff, and that is significant progress over what this conversation was prior to the fall of 2019. And within the schools, there has been more transparency about competing interests and approaches as we have had to learn to name what our interests were. At the beginning of this year, there was permission for the Center for Christian Studies to begin planning an orientation circle for 2021 in consultation with St. Andrew's College, who has been offering admissions programming. We sought innovation grant funding for this initial planning, and the intent is that other schools will be offering orientations in the future. We have also found that the conversation about admissions education has intersected intersected with other conversations about theological education, significantly the conversation about what is testamer, what does it mean to say that someone has fulfilled all of the requirements to be prepared for ministry in the United Church, and how do we deal with folks who come in through the United Church candidacy process, but with a degree previously attained that is not from a United Church of Canada school. So one of the shifts in focus has been towards orientation. And so the intent is that the Center for Christian Studies will host an online admissions orientation circle from August 25th to September 1st, 2021. So that's quite a short planning deadline at this point. The other schools are continuing to offer course-based learning opportunities for admittance that will help them meet the learning guideline goals, those learning outcomes. But we are still left with questions about whose table this is and who our partners are going to be and what our best practices are. Folks might remember that Reverend Paul Walfell asked this question, whose table is this, at General Council 43 in Oshawa, quite prophetically. The planning for admissions orientation confronts us with questions of identity, authority, and interculturality. Admissions ministers might speak with an accent. They might be navigating immigration processes, but they might be from a neighboring Presbyterian congregation down the road. So the question is very live. What are we orienting people to? Is it the United Church of Canada? Is it the Canadian context? Is it Protestantism? Depending on who the admissions minister is, we might be orienting them to all kinds of different things. I think it also, we are confronted with the question of how is orientation different than gatekeeping? And who is best placed to articulate the purpose and goals of an orientation? So when I was a personnel minister in the United Church of Canada and I resourced an interview board, there was very much a sense that the interview board was gatekeeping around admission into the United Church of Canada, giving permission, examining people, asking questions, which is appropriate work. But if we are talking about orientation, I think it becomes much more clear that we need to have voices of people who have been through this experience in the room for the planning, for the articulation of what the goals are, and for how we're going to deliver programming, as well as the delivery of programming. So then this raises the question of how can theological schools equitably partner with people whose lived experiences and perspectives are necessary for planning with integrity. And back in the days when we could meet in person, this is a picture of our planning table around the Center for Christian Studies. When we think about who our partners are in this, this is a place where the United Church Theological schools are working at being in partnership with one another. Specifically, we have been working with St. Andrew's College, and we are also, the schools, working with the Office of Vocation, primarily through the staff, not through the admissions board itself. When we talk about how we are going to involve people with lived experience, we need to ask ourselves questions about, in a planning meeting, who is receiving a salary to be engaged in this work? Who is receiving an honoraria for being engaged in this work? And is it an appropriate amount? And who is just being asked to show up with all of their expertise and experience and just volunteer? And if you think back to that picture of the table, if you could see that most of the staff at the Center for Christian Studies are white. Most of us have grown up in Canada or the US. And so if we are wanting to broaden out our planning cohort to do this work with more integrity, then we need to think about what work we're asking people to do and how are we going to compensate them for not only the expertise they bring to the table, but for the emotional toll that they may be paying to bring this lived experience into the planning process. When we think about best practices at the center, we are always thinking about learning outcomes and goals. We are a competency-based educational model. We come into theological education from an adult education pedagogical stance, and we use praxis, that action and reflection. Our students are, they integrate their field work with their learning circle work and their academic courses and their mentoring work. So we talk about learning in community, honoring the expertise that is in local communities, in local ministry contexts. And we are committed to both preparing people for intercultural ministry and for helping people understand the intersections of power and privilege and oppression and resistance in which we are ministering. So we're trying to find a way forward, and that way includes collaborating, complementing, coordinating, and communicating. Collaborative planning is a really fundamental component of United Church diaconal ministry training, and we actually teach a specific group planning process. Stepping outside the diaconal community confronted us with differing expectations of what collaboration meant. And I really struggled with that in some of the meetings where I had my understanding of what collaboration meant, and it would take me a little while to realize that that's not the same thing that everyone else around the table meant. So rather than co-designing one comprehensive program, that's what I think collaboration means, the collective schools approach might better be described as complementary, with a range of educational opportunities going to be offered across the country. Hopefully the programs will complement one another in scheduling, content, and delivery and geography, because it is a big country and it doesn't make sense to just offer sometimes one piece in one place. Distinguishing between complementing and competing has been sometimes challenging. And we have noticed that this project of trying to collaborate with the other schools has taken priority over collaborating with potential partners. So when we first envisioned this, we had lists of people that we were like, oh yeah, and we'll invite this person and this person and this person in to do this with us. But we have spent so much time with the institutional collaborating, we haven't got to that spot yet of having those collaborative conversations with our more individual partners based on the relationships that we have at the Center for Christian Studies. We have noticed that there have been communication bottlenecks in this work where information maybe went to one person at a school and never made it down to other members of staff. We've noticed that informal networks have meant that some people have had more information at some time than others. Some schools were invited to give feedback on learning outcomes. Other schools seem to have no idea that they were moving to a learning outcome model at all. There has been a lack of clarity on who is leading and facilitating initiatives, and sometimes that has really slowed the work down because no one has said, well, I'm the facilitator, so I'll make sure we have the next meeting planned. We've also noticed a loss of knowledge during staff transitions, not only within general council staff, but within staff transitions at the theological schools as well. And we have noticed that there are real limits within the system or within the schools for capacity for innovation. And if you think back to hearing that our funding, our operating funding was being cut, at the same time we were being asked to innovate, you can see that this is a place where the schools sometimes feel quite pinched in that we are trying to continue to do the things that we do well. We are trying to innovate, but sometimes it's just hard to find the capacity within our school to do all of the things that we want to do. I have also noticed that there is different knowledge at different levels and different tables and different decision-making authorities. So there are times when we're in meetings and it is heads of schools meeting, but there are times when we're in meetings where it is faculty or other coordinators and heads of schools, and some people around the table have the sort of authority within their individual institution to make decisions, and other people have to be taking things back and forth to faculty meetings. I think lastly, we've seen some of the limits of consulting, where we might think, or the church might think they had done consulting, but there were clearly schools that felt like they just, had no idea what was coming in, or that they didn't think that they had input into the decisions that were made and the policy changes that were happening. So this is what we've learned so far, but we are excited about going into the future. This photo is from a great short film, Afronauts, by Nutuona Bodomo. Relationships. This entire experience, which is stretching into 2 years now, has underscored the need for attention to relationships, the importance of building relationships outwards from our institutions and communities, and having permeable community boundaries. So the work of admissions in whole is a work of having permeable community boundaries, but it is also a place where theological schools and the United Church is really challenged to have permeable boundaries around who is invited to the table, who has authority, who has the time, and who is going to be involved in the planning. And I would say that like the Center for Christian Studies, both institutionally and individually as members on staff and governors in the school, that our relationships are the fabric from which we can construct innovative projects. If we didn't have good, life-giving, challenging relationships with a breadth of people across the United Church of Canada, not just our alumni, we would not be able to undertake this work with integrity. So it is in participating in things like the Prairie to Pine or the Western Intercultural and Indigenous Network, in the relationships that we form in these places that are able to equip us to know the right people so that we can do the work that we are called to do. In theological education, these conversations have highlighted the growing importance of continuing education and other non-MDiv programs in constituencies to the life, health, and vibrancy of theological education in Canada. And it has also highlighted the intersections between admissions work, the testamer conversation, how we are equipping for intercultural church, how schools are engaged in anti-racism work, where we are talking about decolonization, where we are working on decolonizing our institutions, and how these intersect with funding conversations, not just with the denomination, but within the schools themselves. And lastly, it confronts us with the question of who is the United Church of Canada? Does the United Church see theological schools as part of the family, as part of the conversation, or as external partners that you ask to do a job for you? It has sometimes brought us up against the question of our streams of ministry within the United Church and how those align or are interpreted in the ecumenical context with partner denominations, and constantly brings us up against questions of authority, orientation, and inclusion. That's a quick run through of some of what we have learned in the process thus far of trying to shift and offer some new programming towards admissions. And I have learned a lot being part of these conversations, and we are really excited to move forward with this work.